I've recently just gotten back from a trip to both Illinois and Wisconsin, where I also managed to visit 3 locations that I highly recommend. First would be Six Flags Great America right out of Chicago, which I plan to do a more in-depth video on soon. Second would be the Wisconsin Dells, consisting of over 20 water parks as well as an overwhelming number of smaller attractions. Third is a small little amusement enterprise called Little America, located among Wisconsin farmland an hour north of Madison. What's special about this little park is the older attractions it contains, providing a lot of unique rides that were bought up and preserved, many of which are rarely found elsewhere. Visiting this park, it gave me the idea to produce a video and discussing the merits of these older historic rides. They thrill you not through their size as most coasters do, but rather through their small and cramped ride vehicles, banging you around violently through these unrefined ride layouts. Of course, I encountered some historic coasters at Six Flags Great America as well, and while definitely on a larger scale than Little America, I thought I would include these in the discussion. So come join me as we discuss these lesser known but unique attractions, exploring their interesting history and ride experiences. Little America was founded by a man named Lee Merrick in 1991, hence the odd spelling for the name of the park. As a livestock renderer and owner of a dog food plant, Merrick opened the park as a hobby, aiming to provide fun to families and revive old amusement park rides. The atmosphere of the park seems meant to evoke a feeling of nostalgia for amusement parks in the 1950s and 60s, and the age of the rides certainly reflects this. If you're familiar with my channel, you'll know that I'm not usually a fan of flat rides, but I can appreciate the older historic nature of many found here. A few favorites would be the Tilt-A-Whirl, which, oddly enough, has a Mario figure in the middle, and the Scrambler, which seems to feel older than most others you might see, though I attribute this to the lack of paint. These attractions aren't that uncommon though, as you can still find them at various traveling fairs and amusement parks throughout the United States. However, one of the park's most interesting attractions is the monorail, which is only one of 2 built by the Allan Herschel Company. Originally built for P&E Park in Omaha, Nebraska, the monorail was then sold to Merrick and established in the park in 1994. P&E Park had closed the same year, struggling financially. While I couldn't find any information on when the monorail was manufactured, the Allan Herschel Company did go out of business in 1970, but P&E Park only added rides to its recreational areas in the 1970s, meaning that this must have been one of the last attractions manufactured by the company. While it's difficult to pinpoint a date on this ride, it does provide calm, scenic views of Little America. The historic nature of the monorail is probably overlooked by most park patrons, but I can appreciate it for what it is. The park also contains 2 Allan Herschel coasters though, the first of which is an older model called the Little Dipper, which I somehow failed to notice on my visit. From what little information is out there, this coaster appears to have been purchased from a private party in Missouri, but it had not been assembled until it was bought and refurbished by Merrick in 1992, then opening the next year at the park. Like many of the other rides here, I was unable to find a date for this, though it was obviously manufactured before 1970. While I didn't ride it myself, it does look a bit rough with its unbanked turns and small bunny hills. Still, when riding older attractions like this, the roughness is part of its appeal to me. Speaking of rough coasters and unbanked turns though, that's a great segue into some of the larger coasters that the park offers. Near the entrance to the park is another Allan Herschel creation, the Mad Mouse. Originally located at the Enchanted Forest theme park in Chesterton, Indiana, which struggled much like P&E Park in the early 1990s, it's one of 3 attractions sold from there to Merrick, including the previously mentioned Scrambler. Like the Little Dipper, its date of manufacture is something that I couldn't find, although I'm inclined to think it was sometime in the 1960s. The Mad Mouse is interesting, in that Wild Mouse style coasters are still quite common and even popular. Still, their unbanked turns are intentional design choices meant to allow riders to experience those lateral G-forces that older models like this allowed to become popular. In the era before Arrow's big steel coasters of the 1970s, little rides like this were probably quite cutting edge for the time. While Wild Mouse coasters are still quite ubiquitous today, they couldn't exist without these earlier gems that are often lost to time. The Mad Mouse was unique to me, in that while its layout and coaster elements were familiar, the ride vehicles themselves were definitely far less comfortable, and the ride experience quite violent. Still, it's interesting to experience something so old, giving insight into the minds of the manufacturers who probably thought that this was a comfortable ride for its time. When the technology available to the designers was so rudimentary, it's interesting to experience the ride where you can physically feel the thought process and intention behind this coaster. It was designed to be thrilling, yet comes off as almost utilitarian, also attempting to get riders back into the station successfully. Hopefully that makes sense the way I've phrased it. In a previous video where I discussed the art of the roller coaster, I made the point that earlier coasters were designed to be more functional, rather than existing as the artistic expressions of intense, complicated elements that we often see today. There's a charm to these earlier expressions of coaster design, and Mad Mouse is a great example of this. By the way, if you've made it this far into the video and find video essays like these to be interesting, I always appreciate people showing support for the channel by just quickly hitting the like button. If you haven't already, I also recommend subscribing as well. Moving to the center of the park, we have the wooden coaster known as Meteor. Manufactured by the Philadelphia Toboggan Company and opening in 1953 at Kittytown, the original name for this coaster was also Little Dipper. Like many early coasters, the name was meant to convey what the coaster was actually doing, as technology had not reached the point where coasters could convey more abstract ideas. In this case, Little Dipper was a name often given to small, child-friendly coasters that mainly featured small dips in the track. However, when the coaster was relocated to Little America in 2007, the name obviously changed to avoid confusion with the other coaster. You'll notice that where early steel coasters lacked the banked turns, at the very least, it was a bit easier for wooden coasters to incorporate this. There's not much to say about Meteor other than it's a nice, historic ride on a decent children's coaster. Finally though, I would like to move on to the main draw of the park, or at least it was for me. As you saw in the intro, this is the Swiss Toboggan. This model of coaster was manufactured by Chance Rides. It was meant to be sold to traveling fairs. However, due to its low capacity, many of these were eventually scrapped instead of maintained, allowing this to be one of only 3 left in existence. The model you see here is actually the prototype, which was built in 1969 and resided at Dogpatch, USA, a now defunct park in Arkansas. It was eventually moved to Enchanted Forest though, and made its debut at Little America in 1993, after also purchasing the Mad Mouse and the Scrambler. It's certainly one of the more unique ride experiences I've had though, first locking you into a tiny cabin and taking you up a vertical lift through a small claustrophobic tunnel. Dropping you out of the top, it sends you down a dizzying spiral and into a violent dip, before then rounding another unbanked turn and bashing your head on the bunny hills. As someone who is 6'3", I had a lot of trouble fitting inside the vehicle, but what I cannot deny is how fun and interesting it was to experience something like this. If you're a coaster enthusiast, this is also one of your rarer and more unique credits, which is also part of its appeal to me. Having now covered Little America though, let's move on to some of the interesting and unique historic coasters of Six Flags. Obviously, Six Flags Great America isn't the only Six Flags park to contain historic coasters, but since my trip was to the Midwest, I might as well mention these. The first coaster I would like to highlight is another wooden coaster quite similar to Meteor. Built in 1950 by the Philadelphia Toboggan Company, this coaster is also known as the Little Dipper. It was built for Kiddie Land, which I would like to distinguish as different from Kiddie Town, where the other renamed Little Dipper came from. However, Kiddie Land closed in 2009, with Six Flags then purchasing this coaster for only $33,000. Its layout is different from Meteor, though its elements are still pretty similar. There's not much else to comment on, other than it's cool to ride a piece of history. However, where Six Flags really gets interesting is with Whizzer. This coaster is one of two Speed Racer models still operating, designed by Anton Schwarzkopf. Great America was originally built by Marriott in 1976 as part of their effort to step into the theme park industry. This coaster did have a clone of the Great America located in California, which is now owned by Cedar Fair, and that coaster was demolished in 1988. Both have had a pretty disastrous history of ride accidents, specifically vehicle collisions within their stations, but significant changes were made after the death of a 14-year-old boy in 1980 at the California location. Okay, so the history behind this attraction isn't great, but it's definitely much safer today and hasn't had an accident in over 40 years. That being said, you're sitting in a pretty open car with just a seatbelt, and it can definitely tend to bang you around inside the vehicle. Notable here is the spiral lift hill, which is cool to see because they're kind of rare these days, and I do like how the track design is the older Schwarzkopf style, even though I find the track from their loopers quite iconic as well. Like many older coasters, it's a bit rough, but that's also part of its appeal. I can also say that part of a coaster experience is the sounds that are made by traveling the ride path, and Whizzer's unique sound palette is quite interesting to listen to. Now, what makes for a classic coaster? Well, American Eagle was Intamin's first wooden coaster in 1981, but it doesn't feel classic to me so much as it feels like it's in the starting era of contemporary wooden coasters. I'm only kind of mentioning it because I think that people in the comments will tell me that I missed it, but I don't have much to say other than it certainly feels old, but has a rather standard layout, which I suppose was exciting for its time. Finishing out Six Flags' older coasters though is Demon, which was built in 1976 and was originally named Turn of the Century. It was manufactured by Arrow, often considered to be the leader in coaster manufacturing throughout the 1970s and 80s, but has since gone out of business after limping on through the 90s. Because they no longer exist, this allows its remaining coasters to feel like unique relics from an older age. Originally sporting a seafoam green paint scheme, the coaster was then rethemed to Demon in 1979, painting the track black, replacing the airtime hills with two vertical loops, and adding rockwork and other theming. Old Arrow coasters can be a bit rough, certainly not to the extent of something like the Swiss Toboggan, but can have odd, slow, and clunky transitions between their elements. Like other earlier steel coasters, the track layout of Demon lets you explore the minds of the designers, revealing that they wanted to incorporate thrilling elements, but they didn't really know how to handle the transitions with the awkward upward hills and turns. Still, as I keep stating, the more rudimentary understanding of coaster design is a fascinating aspect of these older attractions, which makes them worth experiencing. It's not that I would want a coaster like this or Whizzer built today, but I'm glad they're still around because of that classic allure that they still have to them. While the latest and greatest theme park attractions are exciting, I'm also glad that there are people and organizations out there that understand the value of preserving these older rides. I can appreciate old wooden coasters that were deemed worthy of upkeep, or the uniqueness of something like the Swiss Toboggan that definitely would be built today. What makes for a classic coaster though? Well, that's rather arbitrary, as some may consider Aero steel coasters as the first established elements of the contemporary age of theme parks. Yet even these seem like charming antiques by today's standards, surrounded by much larger, more technically complicated track layouts and structures designed with the help of computers for the ultimate ride experience. That's part of what makes these older attractions so interesting. Without computers, designers and manufacturers had a much more difficult time designing ride layouts, resulting in what we now see as primitive constructions. Yet, from a certain perspective, these attractions can be just as impressive as more contemporary coasters, in that the designers had to make a lot of calculated but risky choices without knowing how safe or effective their track and ride vehicles might be. Obviously, a lot of math was involved, along with trial and error, but I think that the technical ability to create something like these rides may go over the heads of current riders who may just perceive them as simple, or unfortunately, even boring. I know that my scope wasn't too broad on this video because I've just focused on these two parks, but I thought that it might lead to a more interesting discussion about the merits of older attractions. I have yet to ride the world's oldest coaster, Leap the Dips, which was built in 1902 and currently exists at Lakemont Park, but that's definitely something I would be interested in trying. If you know of any older, unique attractions worth visiting and talking about, I would certainly be interested in having people share those down in the comments. As always, you can help the channel out by leaving a like on the video and hitting the subscribe button with bell notification if you would like to keep up with new videos.